In this video, we're going to talk about the terrifying moment that an airliner misses the runway. We're also going to debrief how something like this is even possible, and we're going to watch the passengers' reaction because they filmed the entire event. Now let's get started. Go Air Flight 811 is an Airbus A320 doing a routine flight that's only about an hour and 20 minutes long from Nagpur to Bangalore, India. Now the A320 is a very popular aircraft with over 10,000 variants in service, completing over 164 million flights, and there's absolutely no reason why it should have missed the runway because of some of the features that it includes that I'm going to explain later. If you don't know me, I'm Hoover and welcome to your pilot debrief. Now the first problem for this flight is that the captain is 61 years old and has over 20,000 hours of flying experience with over 8,500 hours flying the A320. And normally a lot of experience is considered to be a really good thing, but on this flight, he's paired with a first officer that's only 25 years old and has only 325 hours of experience, and you're going to see why this is a problem later on. During the pre-flight briefing, the crew is told that the weather at Bangalore was forecasted to be 2,000 meters visibility with mist, but temporarily reducing to 800 meters visibility with fog and a cloud base of 200 feet above the ground. The only problem is that during this time of the year, Bangalore is known to have rapidly deteriorating weather due to ground fog, which is why the airport has software that continuously updates and records the weather conditions every 10 seconds for the controllers. Now, because of the forecast weather, the crew had filed 2 alternate destinations, and they were carrying an extra 9,000 pounds of fuel, so that way they could hold for up to 2 hours at their destination if necessary until the weather improved. The crew has an uneventful takeoff, but the captain wanted to give the first officer a chance to fly some, so he passed the controls to the first officer when they were climbing through 1,000 feet, and he let him continue flying until they were descending back through 1,000 feet to land. This is known as 1,000 to 1,000 flying, and it was specifically prohibited by the company. And the main reason why it's not allowed, which is a contributing factor to this mishap, is because especially in poor weather conditions, this doesn't really give the pilot flying the approach below 1,000 feet enough time to settle in and be fully prepared for those responsibilities. During the flight, the weather at Bangalore started to get worse. The automated weather broadcast for the airport was reporting that the weather had reduced to a visibility of 200 meters, an RVR of 1,500 meters, and broken clouds at 200 feet. Now the visibility number is basically just someone in the control tower that's looking out the window at different objects around the airfield that have a known distance from the tower, so it's not necessarily measured in the same direction as the airplanes are landing. Whereas RVR stands for runway visual range, and that's measured by transmissometers located on the runway, normally near the touchdown zone, the middle, and towards the end of the runway, and they measure how far you can see the runway surface markings or lights identifying the runway if you're on the runway center line. So that's why there's a big difference between visibility and RVR. At 014434, the radar controller tells all aircraft that the station visibility was now 200 meters and the RVR had dropped to 1,200 meters. And after this, no further weather updates were provided by air traffic control to the crew on Go Air Flight 811. One of the problems with the weather is even though the A320 and the pilots are certified to perform an auto land using a Category 3 approach, Bangalore only has a Category 1 ILS approach available for runway 09. Now this means the weather needs to be good enough for a decision height of 60 meters or 200 feet, and the visibility must be greater than 800 meters, or the RVR has to be greater than 550 meters. So with the RVR reported as 1,200 meters, they're legal to begin the approach. And the captain has a few different options for how to fly this approach, and you should always plan to fly any approach using the best approach capabilities possible. And like I said, normally that would be the Cat 3 auto land, but in the A320, you can still use the auto land feature if you're flying a Category 1 approach, as long as the runway is in sight and you monitor to ensure the aircraft trajectory remains on the intended path. If you lose sight of the runway or if the aircraft isn't on the right trajectory, then you just execute a go-around. However, the other option is to allow the autopilot to just fly the aircraft down to no lower than decision height. And then if you have sufficient visual reference, you can click off the autopilot and then just hand fly that last part until touchdown. And that's really what the captain is planning to do because he's under the impression that the weather is still good enough to allow that. At 014641, they're cleared for the ILS approach to runway 09 and they're handed off to the tower controller. Now this is when the captain is going to take over the controls from the first officer, and it's also when things start to get really interesting because no one told the pilots that 5 minutes prior to this, the recorded RVR was only 125 meters. There are 3 reasons why they aren't told about the changes in the weather, and these are all contributing factors to this mishap because they each had the potential to prevent it. First, the approach controller is required to issue a special METAR, or basically a weather update, whenever that RVR crosses below different thresholds, and there were several opportunities to do that. However, the controller can't see the weather display because they put folders in between the 2 stations. And even if he did turn to look around the folders, there is still an 82-second time lag between the weather display and the current time. Next, the change in weather happened very rapidly. It only took 5.5 minutes for the RVR to drop from 1200 down to 125 meters, and that happened only 5 minutes before they were cleared for the approach and they were switched over to the tower controller. Third, once the aircraft is handed off to the tower controller, there's supposed to be a weather guy in the tower anytime they have bad weather, but because of the shortage of manpower, the weather guy wasn't there. So there's obviously some big lessons learned for the weather team, but that wasn't the root cause of the mishap. And despite the lack of manpower in the tower, they still have a chance to redeem themselves and save the flight, because while Flight 811 is conducting the approach, there's also a Boeing 737 that's in front of them, and the 737 tells the tower at 014921 that they're going around. And typically when an aircraft performs a go-around, the tower is going to ask you why, especially if you don't give a reason for your go-around. But in this situation, even though the tower has about 30 seconds to ask them about it, they don't say anything. And instead, the tower clears Go Air Flight 811 to land on runway 9. As they continue descending on the approach, the procedures for the crew are pretty simple. You're just going to keep flying the approach on autopilot until you reach your decision height, and then you make a decision to go around, or you continue if you have sufficient visual reference to the runway environment. But there are a few other contributing factors that are going to complicate things. First, the crew is able to see the approach lights while they're still above decision altitude. However, the lighting system used for this runway was the kind of system where the approach lights were brighter and more visible than the runway lights. So by the time they descended to about 100 feet above the ground, the approach lights would be underneath them and no longer visible. The second issue is that they're landing to the east and it's the early morning, so the sun would have been rising and it would have been just 14 degrees above the horizon and 20 degrees to the right of them, which is going to create a glare, further reducing their visibility. And third, there are no centerline lights on the runway, so because of the poor visibility and the glare from the sun, the captain is going to perceive the left runway edge lights to be the centerline lights, so he's going to click off the autopilot, and you're going to see in the video how he's going to start banking left, even though he no longer has adequate visual references to the runway environment. And just to clarify the meaning of visual reference, the investigation says that a pilot can't continue the approach below decision altitude unless at least one of the following references for the intended runway is distinctly visible. So he had the approach lights, but then he lost sight of them, and the only other lights that he mentions seeing are what he assumes are the centerline lights, which aren't even on this list. And even though he sees the runway edge lights, he's only seeing the left edge lights, so that's not sufficient to continue the approach. Now remember when I mentioned earlier the age and experience difference between the captain and the first officer. That's another factor here because it can lead to situations where the first officer is afraid to speak up or really question anything that the captain is doing. And in a situation like this, if the first officer isn't feeling comfortable about the landing because he no longer sees the runway environment, he needs to say go around, but instead he basically just freezes up. When they're 110 feet above the ground, the captain starts turning left, using up to 10 degrees of bank, and he also pulls back on the stick to significantly slow down his rate of descent in order to give him more time to find the runway. So he basically almost levels off about 25 feet above the ground, and the auto thrust goes back to idle and the airspeed starts to decay. And while he's doing this, the first officer never makes any call-outs regarding the bank angle or the deviation to the left of the localizer course, which they end up being 3.5 units left of course by the time they hit the ground. The only reason this wasn't any worse was because 2 seconds prior to hitting the ground, the first officer finally made a call to go around and the captain executed the maneuver, but it was too late. And they touched down with a firm 1.8 Gs of force and they rolled on the ground for 5 seconds before getting airborne, and the left engine would stall but eventually recovered at idle thrust. Now watch what happens from the passenger perspective because as far as they know, everything is completely normal. Now this was filmed by one of the passengers, but what you don't get a sense of is what the forward visibility looks like. I mean, looking out the window here, you can barely see the ground even as they're flying over it. You're going to see the runway come into view right here. You're going to see the airplane start drifting to the left as the captain is trying to line up on what he thinks is the center line, but he obviously doesn't see anything here. And what's interesting is how long he actually kind of flies along over the ground here before they finally touch down. And that knocking sound that you heard is coming from the left engine because it's stalling right now. And what I find most interesting about the video here is the passenger, how he says, yes, the flight missed the runway, but it didn't land there. The pilot saved us by taking off and ultimately landing somewhere else. It's almost as if he's blaming the airplane for what happened and the pilot was a savior here. And I don't think the guy realizes how close he was to dying because of a mistake that the pilot made. And overall, there were a lot of factors contributing to this mishap that could have prevented it from happening. And it just goes to show you the importance of understanding weather minimums and what you need to conduct an approach. But ultimately, the root cause of the mishap was the captain's decision to continue the approach below decision height without sufficient visual reference to the runway environment. And if you learned something from this pilot debrief, then be sure to check out another one on the channel, and I'll see you next time.